The most disturbing, the most depressing, the strangest, and the most controversial albums I've all talked about. And in this video, I want to talk to you guys about the heaviest albums that I know. When it comes to an album being considered heavy for my personal standards, there's a lot more to it than just it being fast, aggressive, and loud. And while, yes, those are important key factors for my standards for an album being heavy, as there are going to be a lot of albums I'm going to talk about in this particular video that are in the realms of extreme metal, mainly because it seems like for a lot of extreme metal bands, they put the heaviness factor of their sound at the forefront. So let it be known those are important factors, but they're not the only factors here, as there are some albums I picked that aren't necessarily extreme metal, but I consider them to be extremely heavy, mainly because of how the ambience, production value, or the density of the atmosphere is, that I feel like in other aspects it's just as heavy as extreme metal bands. But just let it be known there's a lot more to my personal standards in an album being heavy than it's just played fast. And another disclaimer for a standard that I want to attach with this video is to help expand my selection. I don't want to just bring up albums that I brought up numerous times before on my channel. So examples like Hatred for Mankind by Dragged Into Sunlight, Swarth by Portal, and even Damar's demo, Spears Through Sacrilege of Triumph. While those are extremely heavy albums, I'm not denying that. It's just I have videos all about them in my explaining series, and I just don't want to rinse, wash, and repeat the things I've said before onto this video. And again, to help expand the selection of what there is to talk about, at least on my channel, I'm not going to include these albums, but again, let it be known, I still consider them very heavy. And like always with this series, if I get the same amount as participation as I have with the previous videos, with the comments that you guys recommend me, then yes, the next video coming up will be the heaviest albums that you know. Keeping the tradition going with this series, I always like bringing up the album that comes to mind first for the subject matter. And if someone were to ask me what is the heaviest album that I know, immediately my mind would think of Tetragrammacide with their EP, Typhonium Wormhole's Indecipherable Anti-Structural Formula. For those who don't know, Tetragrammacide is an extreme metal band based out of India, and their style of music is characterized as war noise, as it's a mixture of war metal, that's style that blends black metal, death metal, thrash metal, and all the other forms of extreme metal in a blender, but it also adds an extra ingredient, that being power electronics. To put it bluntly, Tetragrammacide honestly makes all other extreme metal bands, especially in the realms of war metal like Blasphemy, Revenge, Conqueror, and Beherit, honestly sound like easy listenings. The music on this release is so sadistic, abrasive, and chaotic that it feels like the overall intention for this was to be an audio assault on your senses. I remember back when I first heard this release. Before then, I thought I heard it all in extreme metal, that, you know, I've heard the most extreme of the extreme, it can't get any more crazy than that. And then when Tetragrammacide came up, when people were telling me about it and I heard some people talking about it, honestly, after the intro track, I was floored and flabbergasted at what I was hearing. I truly didn't believe that metal, music for that matter, could get this barbaric. It truly just feels like every little thing that they're doing, from their vocals, the guitar riffs, if you can even make it out, to just all the noises you are hearing. It truly feels like they did this with the purpose of, let's go the next level in extreme music. Regardless if people like it or not, I want to make the most barbaric and heaviest thing on planet Earth. And while it might be a bit overbearing for some people, I'm not trying to make it seem like it's this kind of like a, I don't know, hierarchy of how you can enjoy extreme metal. It's just, it really pushes it to the point that it will be overbearing. But for me personally, if you were to truly ask me what is the heaviest thing right now in terms of music on planet Earth, honestly, my mind always says Tetragrammacide right away. Knelt Rote, Trespass is one of my personal favorites in extreme metal if I'm purposely looking for like the ultra barbaric and super over the top sound for it, as it's a mixture of black metal, death metal, and grindcore together, that I've always said this, and I mean this, and I know it's a bold and hot take, but Knelt Rote is the extreme metal band that other war metal bands think they sound like. Just like Tetragrammacide, it's super over the top, ultra violent, and everything just feels like a whirlwind of chaos. That one way I guess I could describe it is if you've ever wondered what a black hole would sound like in a musical way, this kind of feels like the representation of that. But I must admit to you guys, a huge reason as to why I have a strong bias with including Knelt Rote in this video is I will never ever forget at the time that I saw them live. I believe it was at the 2015 Maryland Death Fest, and I wanted to see Portal. And in order to do so, I wanted to get a really good seat and wait out all the bands that were playing before them. And the band that was playing right before Portal was Knelt Rote. And at the time, I knew nothing about them. I just figured I'll sit through this extreme metal band, I get to see Portal in a good seat. So when they played, I had no idea what I was in for. And it was the only time ever that I've seen people cover their ears with a metal band playing. They were easily the loudest show I've ever attended, that to this day I can still just vividly remember just the harshness of everything hitting me from their sound. That I know it's going to sound like I'm kind of overselling them here, but it's the only time I was like truly scared for my well-being, just how loud it was. I thought I was going to pass out, honestly. It was truly one of the most intense things I've ever witnessed a band playing. And when they were done playing, honestly, the first thing that went through my head was, that was the heaviest performance I've ever seen and probably will ever see for the rest of my life. Last Days of Humanity, Putrefaction in Progress. These guys are one of the originators for the style of music of gore grind. And while a lot of people credit Carcass with their earliest releases for their full lengths as like the first gore grind album, it kind of falls under that debate with Venom and Bathory, who's the first real black metal band. Because how I've looked at some conversations is that Carcass is a prototype to gore grind. Yes, it blends elements of death metal and grindcore together, that it kind of leans into the idea of gore grind, where Last Days of Humanity formed, I believe, back in 1989, and some of their demos will be released in the early 90s, is the first true 100% embodiment for gore grind. To be fair, you can include literally any album by Last Days of Humanity and claim it to be the heaviest album ever made, and there really honestly won't be that much debate against that claim. Because the one way that I look at it is, as I stated earlier, Tetragrammacide makes every other like black metal and war metal band kind of sound like easy listenings. Last Days of Humanity makes every death metal and brutal death metal band honestly sound like something that belongs on like a friendly children's radio station. But I chose the fan favorite album, Putrefaction in Progress, because it gets to like a whole other level now, especially how fast the drums are being played to the point that it just sounds like noise, like good luck making out any of the snare heads. And the guitar riffs, if you even want to call it that, again, are kind of just making noise, along with these super ultra over-the-top vocals that I know a lot of people say like it sounds like gurgling, gargling type of like noises. This really gets it to the point that it's very animalistic. It doesn't really sound like a human should be making these sounds. That from what I've heard with some reviews on it, people claim that this gets into the territory now not so much of gore grind, but into the territory of gore noise. If memory serves me right, there's around like roughly 36 songs on this album, again ranging around like a minute to 90 seconds at most, and it's just going to feel like this really brutal lightning strike hitting you repeatedly over and over again. For me personally, when it comes to the realms of more of the brutal side of extreme metal into the death metal region, nobody comes even close to the heaviness and brutality aspect of Last Days of Humanity, and they built a reputation off of that even though I know gore grind's kind of like this niche thing for some people, I feel like if you want to get into gore grind, Last Days of Humanity is basically like the Judas Priest, as weird as this sounds, for this style of music. Khanate, To Be Cruel. Another band that you could say literally anything by them fits into the category of one of the heaviest albums ever made. And before I get into a description about them, once again, I feel like I need to thank everyone who recommended me these guys over and over again. Ever since I did my Doom Metal Iceberg chart, I've been repeatedly being recommended this particular band, as it takes drone doom metal to new heights of just density. And man, you guys were not joking with Khanate, and how perfectly fitting that the year I get into them, which again, better late than never, is I think they've been active, or they started out like almost a little over 2 decades ago. This would be the same year that they would have like a comeback album, and this is why I'm talking about their latest full length. But again, you could literally include anything they've done. And Khanate plays in the style of drone doom metal, where a lot of people say it sounds similar to that of Sun, but I disagree on that completely. Other than the fact that they're both played extremely slowly, and yes, Khanate's instrumentation is slow, it's simplistic, and really minimalistic for the most part. It just feels like every note that they play on their instruments is equivalent to that of 2 tons of bricks falling on your head. The ambience and atmosphere that this band creates is so dense that it's honestly kind of nauseating at some points. And I know that kind of sounds like, how is this interesting? Why would I want to listen to something that would do that to me? But I guess it's just that overall experience where it really starts to challenge my understanding of how heavy a band can be, even though they're playing it extremely slowly, that I find fascination with it, honestly. That, along with the vocal performance done by their frontman, Alan, who has just such twisted and deranged vocals, how he executes every single verse that he does, that I know I've always stated that Rainer Landferman, with his vocal performance on Bethlehem's Dictus Te Nakir, has always been a personal favorite of mine for extreme metal, just because of how signature and deranged it is. But I would say ever since I discovered Khanate, again thanks to you guys, Alan's vocal performance honestly rivals the deranged nature of Rainer Landferman for me. I'll admit, I'm not really a fan that much of anything to do with drone music, and when it's blended together with doom metal, that's where you really lose me. But honestly, even with that being stated and me being aware of that, Khanate has definitely made me at least appreciate this style of music when it's blended together, and it's solely because of just how heavy every little detail that they do, as slow as they play everything, with just how dense the ambience and atmosphere is, that I become a fan of them, and I would easily say they are one of the heaviest doom metal bands you'll ever hear. Sissy Spacek, Disfathom, is a noise grind band based out of California, and prior to discovering this band, I was recommended it to me by a friend who told me Sissy Spacek is one of the truest like underground noise bands and noise grind artists out there, that it makes things like Prurient and Pharmakon seem like poser shit. And after hearing that, I was like, that's some really bold claims to say. And I was really confused at first too, considering that Sissy Spacek is the name for the actress who played Carrie back in the 70s. Along with the fact that Sissy Spacek, I believe for a little bit, had like this country music star phase going off. So again, just at face value, the band Sissy Spacek doesn't sound that intimidating. But after hearing their 2016 full-length album, Disfathom, and it only goes on for like 12 or 15 minutes long, it's honestly the most misleading band name ever, because this is some of the most obnoxious grindcore I've ever heard. It is so ungodly abrasive, and the density of how everything is. It's not just like noise that's just static noise, it's like noise that feels like it has weight to it. Honest to God, feels like there are shock waves coming out of my speakers whenever I listen to this. Morbid Saint, Spectrum of Death. As odd as this is to say, this is arguably the most accessible album I've talked about, and more than likely will talk about for the rest of the video. And you might be wondering now, why am I including this in this video? And honestly, it's because, yeah, there's a bit of a biased take on my behalf because I've listened to it so much over the past handful of months. Along with the fact that I've noticed that I would argue this is as heavy as thrash metal can get, that I would argue that it's considered to be brutal thrash metal. where you have just these obnoxious and explosive guitar riffs, these thunderous drums that come through on the percussions, and the vocals that have just such a vicious execution on it that just cuts through all the chaos. For me, when it comes to thrash metal, Morbid Saint, Spectrum of Death, it's the heaviest in my personal viewpoint. Swans, Filth. This is their debut full-length album from 1983. And Swans is mostly known in playing in a style of music that's, well, various. They play around with a lot of different forms of music, from neo-folk, punk, post-punk, noise rock, industrial, electronic, you name it. More than likely, Swans has played around with it in some way, shape, or form. But with their debut full-length album, Filth, this is a mixture of, I guess you could say, industrial, kind of like noise rock is one way of describing it. And what sells it for me and a lot of other people is I've noticed that a lot of people say like this is one of the heaviest albums that ever made, or like one of the heaviest albums that isn't characterized as metal, is just how dense and gritty the tone is on this album. It honest to God feels like that every time I'm hearing the percussions being played, it's like a sledgehammer is just hitting me over the head. It's just so unapologetically gritty and raw how it is, that if you're looking for more of like the heaviness factor in terms of music, but more on the atmosphere and overall vibe of the album, Swans, Filth. I know it's an album that gets talked about around a lot on the internet, but it definitely deserves the title as one of the heaviest albums out there. Blackhandpath, Egregore. Now I recently talked about this album roughly around a month ago when I did a video on rap albums for metal fans, and I recommended this mainly because it honestly sounds like it should be considered like extreme hip hop. There's just a lot happening on this album. Everything's overblown, especially the percussions and beats on it. Add to the fact what just adds to the intensity is the verses just are all shouted out with just such as edgy, angry nature that it makes it all the more pulverizing. That I would honestly say, as bold as this rap album is heavier than a lot of extreme metal albums that people have been hyping up over the past handful of years. Alec Empire, The Destroyer. As most of you guys know, Alec Empire is one of the masterminds for the band Atari Teenage Riot. And ever since I've talked about Atari Teenage Riot with some of my friends and here on YouTube, I'm always getting requested to talk about his solo work as he goes more off the walls with his ideas and experimentation for what he deems it to be as digital hardcore. And after discovering the album The Destroyer by Alec Empire, I would say this is Alec at his most primitive, honestly, when it comes to this approach of digital hardcore, because it's a mixture of obviously like electronic, hardcore techno, drum and bass, elements like that are often, characterized as what you would describe Atari Teenage Riot, but this just feels so much more knuckle dragging and feels like it belongs in a back alley street fight. The percussions and synthesizers being played on this album have such a sense of urgency attached with it that it makes it all the more harrowing and adds to the intensity all the more, making it feel like as if this is a really extreme take on hardcore techno music. Hanatarash, with their album Hanatarash 3, was a very easy choice for me to include here because I would say this is the heaviest and most brutal sounding noise music can get. As most already know, but in case if you don't, Hanatarash is a very infamous Japanese noise group that is known for being the band that drove a forklift through a concert venue wall at one of their shows. But the real reason I consider this the heaviest noise album is because it's noise music being played by musicians that have a strong hardcore punk mindset. Everything being played on this album has just a strong visceral sense to it that it feels like it's just meant to encompass chaos in its purest form. And I know I'm getting a little bit pretentious describing a noise album, But honest to God, everything just feels so insane to me that I think it's just the insanity levels about this album that truly makes it brutal and heavy for me, that almost gives off like this weird psychological effect. Again, maybe I'm just getting too into discussing this album, but as I stated, I consider this to be the heaviest noise album. SPK, Like and Try, will be the last album included in this video, and this is considered to be one of the earliest forms of purebred industrial music, as it was released back, I believe, in 1982, and I consider this one of the heaviest albums because it's all the manipulation on the electronic aspect on this album that just makes it sound surreal and unnatural, how they were able to manipulate these sounds, yet it still comes off cohesive because there's a lot of groove to how the instrumentation is on it. So there is a sense of composition, there is a sense of self-awareness with the fact that it's still music that they're trying to create. One way I guess I could describe this is this album sounds like I'm in this industrial factory, but it's the most morbid, cryptic, and messed up industrial factory on planet Earth. Because even with the rhythm sections you'll hear, it's still just really unsettling to me. And with the vocals that come through on this album on the rare occasions that it does, it just honestly sends shivers down my spine just because of how unnatural, disorienting, and heavy that it is, that I feel like for industrial music, for something you want to get into, for more of like the old school approach to industrial music, SBK's Like and Try is one of the best places to start out with, along with others like a Throbbing Gristle and whatnot. But it's heavy to me just solely because of how unnatural everything sounds like. And that'll do it for this video, guys. Really curious to know what are albums that you consider to be the heaviest. Like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below, and that'll do it. So like always, guys, make sure you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.